Picture this. A bitter wind howls through the damp stone corridors of Newark Castle. The year is 1216, the month, October. Inside those walls, behind a wooden door soaked with mildew, a king is dying. But not with dignity, not with ceremony, not even with comfort. There are no loyal knights keeping vigil, no priest reciting psalms, no golden crown resting gently at the bedside. There is only a pallet soaked with sweat, a torch flickering in the damp, and a man twitching, groaning, breaking apart from the inside out. His stomach spasms violently. His mouth lets out half-formed screams. His eyes flicker not with royal power, but with terror. This man, writhing in filth and agony, is John Lackland, the King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou. A monarch in title, but in truth a dying man consumed by the very poison he spent his life spreading. The cause? Not an assassin's blade, not a battlefield wound, but dysentery, a violent, bloody illness that ripped his intestines apart until one chronicler grimly wrote, "The king's bowels burst from within." In the end, the man who had ruled through fear and cruelty met not a noble death, but one as grotesque and unceremonious as his reign. And here lies the paradox. The man who had become the infamous villain of the Robin Hood legend, the king no monarch ever dared name a son after again for more than 800 years, left behind a legacy that would outlive him not because of what he built, but because of how spectacularly he failed. But to understand how a king could rot both in body and legacy, we have to go back. Back to his birth. Back to the shadow that followed him from the cradle to the grave. He was born in the year 1166, the youngest of 4 sons born to King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women in European history. By the time John arrived, the family was already fractured. The crown was spoken for. The lands were claimed. The alliances had been made. There was, quite simply, nothing left to give him. His father, with a cruel sense of humor, called him Jean Santerre, John Lackland. It was more than a nickname. It was a prophecy. While his elder brothers fought in wars, John plotted in shadows. His hunger for recognition, for power, for validation, it started early. And it would never leave him. When his brother, Richard the Lionheart, embarked on the Third Crusade in the year 1190, John did not follow. He stayed behind. But not to rule wisely in his brother's absence, he stayed to scheme. Whispers spread across the kingdom that Richard had died in battle. Those whispers, it turns out, had John's fingerprints all over them. He allied himself with Richard's enemies. He even tried to declare himself king before Richard returned. When Richard was captured in Austria on his way home, John actively tried to delay his release, hoping the crown would fall into his lap. But fate denied him. Richard returned, and in a twist of almost absurd generosity, forgave his treacherous brother. John was forced back into the shadows, bitter, embarrassed, and no doubt seething with resentment. But destiny would not be denied forever. In the year 1199, a crossbow wound took Richard's life in France, and with Richard dead and no legitimate heirs to block him, John finally took the throne. At last, the youngest son, the overlooked schemer, was King of England, and almost immediately, everything began to collapse. His reign, which would last 17 years, was a litany of disasters. He was no warrior. He was no statesman. He was, as some would say, a king in title only. Unlike his brother Richard, whose courage had earned him the title Lionheart, John earned another name, Soft Sword, a nickname born from cowardice, not compassion. By the year 1204, John had already lost Normandy, a cornerstone of the Angevin Empire. Along with it went Anjou, Maine, and Poitou territories that had belonged to his family for generations. The French king, Philip II, outmaneuvered him at every turn. While John sulked, Philip conquered. England's once mighty holdings in France crumbled under John's weak grip. To pay for these failures, John did what all desperate kings do: he bled his people dry. He levied tax after tax. Scutage, a payment in lieu of military service, was demanded not once or twice, but 11 times in 17 years more than his 3 predecessors combined. He taxed land. He taxed income. He taxed inheritance. He taxed wool, wine, widows, and even the clergy. If it could move, it could be taxed. If it couldn't move, it could be taxed twice. But taxation was only the beginning. John ruled with a petty, almost sadistic cruelty. Nobles were extorted. Families were blackmailed. Children were taken as hostages. No one was safe from his paranoia. And the whispers returned. There was a boy, Arthur of Brittany, John's young nephew, and a legitimate rival to the throne. Arthur disappeared while in John's custody. The world assumed the truth. John had killed him. And now, the nobles who once merely feared him began to hate him. One woman, Matilda de Braus, dared to speak the rumor aloud. John retaliated by imprisoning her and her son. He gave them no food. After 11 days, guards opened the door to find them both starved to death. A chronicler wrote that in her final madness, Matilda gnawed the flesh from her dead child's cheeks. It was one of the darkest episodes in a reign already soaked in cruelty. And yet, John was not finished. Not with the barons, not with the church, not even with God. But that is where we must pause for now, because what comes next is a slow-burning war between a king and everyone around him, between tyranny and rebellion, between divine right and human law, between a man who believed himself untouchable and the people who decided he would not be. In Part 2, Born with Nothing, Obsessed with Power, we will descend deeper into John's war against the church, the betrayal of Magna Carta, and the unstoppable spiral towards civil war and eventual collapse. This is not just a story of a king who died in filth. It's the story of a man whose failures gave birth to one of the most powerful ideas in history. Stay with me. John was a man who came into the world with empty hands and spent the rest of his life clawing at anything that shimmered with the illusion of power, and when he could not earn it, he took it. When he could not keep it, he crushed it in his fist like sand, even as it slipped through his fingers. And so began the next chapter of his reign. A reign marked not just by failure, but by an unrelenting war against every pillar that held the realm together, including the very church that crowned him king. It began with a question of succession not to the throne, but to the church's highest seat in England, the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and when the monks of Canterbury and the king disagreed on who should be appointed, John, ever arrogant and controlling, insisted on his own candidate, a man who would serve his will, bend to his demands, and tether the church's voice to the crown's command. But Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful pontiff of the age, refused, and with that refusal, a spiritual war was declared not just between monarch and cleric, but between heaven and crown, between divine authority and royal ego. In retaliation, John seized church lands, looted church revenues, and declared his own authority supreme within his realm, as though he could silence the bells of Christendom with a decree and a royal seal. And for that audacity, the Pope struck back with one of the most devastating weapons in the medieval arsenal, the interdict, a spiritual blockade that plunged all of England into a kind of holy exile. Churches were closed, bells went silent, marriages could not be consecrated, burials could not be blessed. And for 6 long years, from the year 1208 to 1214, the people of England lived as spiritual orphans, cut off from the sacraments, from forgiveness, from the divine rhythms that had anchored their lives for centuries. And yet John would not relent, not until the Pope excommunicated him personally in the year 1209, declaring him damned in the eyes of Christendom, and only then, when his throne seemed at risk from both divine and earthly threats, did John perform the most humiliating act of submission in his reign. He surrendered his kingdom to the Pope, offered it as a papal fief, and in exchange became a vassal of Rome, paying tribute to the very man he had defied, a move both cowardly and cunning, for it turned the Pope from an enemy into an overlord, and thus made John's enemies, particularly his rebellious barons, guilty of insurrection not just against a king, but against the church itself. But this was only a temporary reprieve. For while John had appeased Rome, he had alienated almost every other faction within his realm. The barons he extorted, the merchants he taxed into poverty, the peasants he ignored, the clergy he had insulted, all had been pushed beyond endurance. And in the year 1215, the kingdom that John had ruled with paranoia and cruelty finally rose up against him. Led not by foreign invaders or rival claimants, but by his own subjects, who gathered in defiance and demanded justice, not with swords at first, but with parchment. On the 15th day of June, 1215, in a meadow by the River Thames called Runnymede, history trembled beneath the feet of barons and scribes, for it was here that John was presented with a document, unlike any he had seen before, a Charter of Liberties, later known as Magna Carta, a list of grievances and demands that sought not to dethrone the king, but to bind him, to place limits upon his will, to protect the rights of the free men of England. And though it was born of desperation and drafted by nobles seeking to protect their own privileges, within its clauses lay revolutionary seeds. No man shall be imprisoned without trial, the king is not above the law, taxes must be levied with consent, and justice must not be sold, delayed, or denied. John, cornered and seething, signed it, or rather affixed his seal not from conviction but from fear, and the barons, believing they had caged the tyrant, celebrated their fragile victory. But they had misunderstood John entirely, for he believed that no oath made under duress was binding, that kings were appointed by God, not negotiated with by nobles. And so, in secret, and with venom still dripping from his words, he wrote to Pope Innocent III and begged him to annul the charter. The Pope, loyal now to his vassal, obliged, and with a single papal bull, Magna Carta was declared null and void. In that moment, John did more than break a promise, he shattered the illusion of reform, and the kingdom, already frayed and trembling, erupted into the First Barons' War. It was civil war, bitter and raw, and the rebels, pushed beyond reason, made a decision that shocked the Christian world. They invited Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, to cross the Channel and claim the English throne. Better, they thought, to kneel to a foreign prince than to continue suffering under a native tyrant. And so, in the spring of 1216, Prince Louis landed in Kent, was welcomed in London, and declared himself king in all but name, and John, once lord of vast dominions, now found himself a fugitive in his own land, his enemies marching beneath English and French banners, his allies scattered or dead, his throne all but lost, and in that desperation, in that spiraling chaos, began the final chapter of his reign. But we are not yet at his end. By the autumn of the year 1216, John was no longer a king in command. He was a shadow dragging a crown, a desperate man presiding not over a kingdom, but over the ashes of one. And as rebellion scorched the countryside and the fleur-de-lis of France waved from the towers of London, he moved with increasing urgency through the crumbling realm, not as a sovereign but as a hunted thing, a man fleeing the consequences he had spent 2 decades sowing. It was during one of these frantic retreats that he made the fateful decision to cross the Wash, a tidal estuary on the eastern coast of England known not for beauty or strategy, but for treachery, a place of shifting sands and unforgiving tides, a shortcut that promised speed and delivered ruin. And John, true to his nature, chose it not with caution, but with arrogance, believing that if he could pass through it safely, then all else would fall into place, that he could outrun not just the French, but fate itself. He crossed first, on horseback, accompanied by his core retinue, and made it to the other side soaked, cold, but alive. Yet it was not he who would pay the immediate price for the decision, but the long, creaking train of wagons behind him, each one groaning with the weight of his personal treasury, the accumulated spoils of years of extortion, taxes, bribes, and theft, gold, silver, sacred relics, and the most precious of all, the crown jewels of England. Among them, legends say, the very crown once worn by Alfred the Great. But time and tide waits for no king. The water rose faster than expected. The sands beneath the wheels betrayed their weight, and in a matter of minutes, the entire baggage train, horses, guards, treasures was swallowed by the sea, devoured by the estuary in a silent act of poetic revenge. No battle had been fought, no sword had been raised, and yet John had lost everything that gave his kingship shape and symbol. His wealth, his power, his legacy all pulled beneath the surface, never to be recovered, a grave of mud and salt and shame. Some said it was God's justice. Others whispered it was the land itself rejecting him. Whatever the truth, John emerged from the crossing not as a monarch, but as a man broken open. From there he made his way to Swineshead Abbey, a remote outpost where the body finally began to betray the mind. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, and trembling with fever, he collapsed into what some chroniclers called a final feast. Whether it was peaches and new cider or pears and ale, no one agrees, but what is certain is that it was too much for a stomach already knotted by dread and weeks of unrelenting stress, and by nightfall, the first cramp struck. Then came the fever. Then came the flood. This was no mere stomachache, no ordinary illness from a bad harvest or spoiled wine. This was dysentery in its medieval form, a violent bacterial assault that ripped the intestines raw, turned the body into a leaking, burning battlefield, and left the strongest of men sobbing for death. John, once the Lord of England and Normandy, once the tyrant who had extorted barons and defied the Pope, was now a shivering wreck, doubled over in pain, leaking filth, unable to ride a horse, unable even to sit upright. His body shook with every movement, and so his men, those few who remained, placed him gently on a litter and carried him toward Newark Castle, one of the last fortresses still loyal to him. The journey was slow and filled with torment. Every jolt of the cart was agony. Every mile stretched like a confession. There were no great proclamations, no battle flags, no cheering crowds. Only the stench of sickness, the silence of dying leaves, and the sound of a king gasping, writhing, whispering apologies that may have come too late. By the time they reached Newark, it was the 16th of October, and John had no strength left to pretend he was a king. He was placed in a bed, not of silk or velvet, but of straw soaked in his own sweat. The flickering torches made shadows dance on the stone walls, and in those final hours, he began to speak not as a ruler, but as a man confessing to the void. He dictated his will. He named his 9-year-old son Henry as his heir. He begged forgiveness from God, and he wept whether from fear or shame, no one knows. Perhaps in those last moments, his mind drifted back to the child he may have murdered, Arthur of Brittany, whose ghost still hovered over every mention of succession. Perhaps he saw the starved face of Matilda de Braose, or the eyes of the barons whose sons he had taken as hostages. Perhaps he realized, too late, that power wielded without mercy eventually devours itself. He died 2 days later on the night of the 18th of October, in the year 1216, not with dignity but with torment, not in triumph but in isolation, not surrounded by mourning courtiers, but by the fetid consequences of his own reign. The chroniclers, many of whom had despised him in life, recorded his death with a peculiar satisfaction. They wrote not of a noble farewell, but of a body bursting from within, of a man so full of rot, so hollowed by greed, that even death could not come cleanly. And so ended the life of John Lackland, the tyrant king, the soft-sword monarch, the man who stole crowns and trust and peace, and who in the end could not even keep his own bowels from betraying him. But his story strangely does not end in that soiled bed, because in the vacuum he left behind, something miraculous began to form. When John Lackland drew his final shuddering breath in that dim chamber of Newark Castle on the 18th of October in the year 1216, England did not mourn. Not truly, not openly, not as a kingdom. Grieves its sovereign for his death was not met with lamentation, but with a kind of stunned silence, like the quiet that settles after a long and violent storm, when the sky is still dark, but the wind has finally stopped screaming, and the people, barons, bishops, peasants and princes alike, stood at the edge of a precipice, not certain whether they had escaped disaster or simply paused before a deeper fall. For a moment, the kingdom teetered. The French Prince Louis, already welcomed in London as a saviour by rebel lords, now had an open path to the throne. No longer would he have to wrest it from the hands of a tyrant, but simply reach for it in the void left behind. And yet, something remarkable happened in that moment of vacancy, something that no one, not the barons, not the church, not even the French had fully anticipated. The appearance of a child, a boy barely 9 years old, with the trembling hands of a son who had lost a father, and the unburdened heart of one untouched by sin. His name was Henry, the son of John, grandson of Henry II, nephew of Richard the Lionheart, and now, by blood and law, the rightful king of England. But how do you crown a boy in the midst of war? How do you lift a child above the ashes of rebellion, betrayal, and despair? The answer came not from kings or princes, but from a single man, a knight of immense stature, honour, and unshakable loyalty. William Marshal, the Earl of Pembroke, a warrior so revered that even his enemies could not speak his name without a measure of respect. And it was he, alone among the wreckage, who saw what had to be done not merely to preserve the crown, but to preserve the soul of a country. In haste, in secrecy, in trembling hope, he gathered the child Henry and rode with him to Gloucester Cathedral, one of the few places left untouched by the fires of war. And there, before a modest gathering of loyalists and priests, he performed an act that was part coronation, part miracle. He crowned the boy king, not with splendor or fanfare, but with quiet purpose, and placed upon his small head, not the lost crown of Alfred the Great swallowed days earlier by the sea, but a makeshift circlet, simple and symbolic, forged not from gold but from will. And it worked, for reasons no one fully dared hope. The rebellion wavered. The barons, who had risen not out of lust for conquest but out of desperation to restrain a tyrant, looked upon the child, not with fear, but with possibility. Here was not another John, drunk on control, but a boy yet untainted, a vessel they could guide, shape, and counsel, a sovereign who would listen rather than command, forgive rather than punish, and reign through balance rather than blood. But Marshal knew that a crown alone would not be enough. There were still French forces in Kent, mercenaries in the countryside, castles held by traitors, and worst of all, the Charter, that parchment of promises signed and shattered by the dead king, now lay in political limbo, its authority questioned, its clauses in disarray, its very survival uncertain. And so, with the wisdom of a statesman and the clarity of a knight, Marshal did the unthinkable. He reissued Magna Carta, not the original, not the defiant charter forced upon a furious John, but a revised version, stripped of its most radical demands, softened in language but firm in purpose, and in doing so, he rescued its spirit while excising the words that might provoke fresh war. It was an act of surgical genius. He did not destroy the rebellion, he disarmed it. He gave the barons the very thing they had claimed to fight for, a lawful king, bound by a lawful charter, governed by lawful restraint. The church, still reeling from years of insult and suppression, now saw a boy who had been crowned with humility and endorsed by Marshal, a man the clergy deeply respected. The peasants, exhausted by levies and war, saw a new hope on the horizon, not because they expected mercy, but because they expected change. And the French, sensing the shift in wind, began to lose ground, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of those who had once welcomed them. Within a year, Prince Louis's campaign unraveled. His supporters defected, his momentum collapsed, and eventually, the French were pushed back across the Channel, not by overwhelming force, but by the power of a new narrative. That England had a king again, and not just any king, but a child king with a knight's hand on his shoulder and a charter in his pocket. From the wreckage of John's reign, a fragile peace emerged, not because the country had healed, but because the people had chosen not to bleed further. And that is how the tyrant's death saved the throne. Not by design, not by redemption, but by absence. His departure was the medicine. His failure, the seed of a new foundation. But nothing in history is ever so simple, nor so clean. Because Magna Carta, the very document born of his refusal to yield, would not simply remain a local peace treaty or a list of baronial demands. It would grow. It would echo. It would travel beyond centuries and borders and become something even John could never have imagined. A symbol. Empires do not vanish in a single day. They erode in layers, dignity first, then loyalty, then law, and finally memory. And by the time John Lackland was lowered into the earth, his body still bloated and fevered with rot, the empire of his ancestors had already become more ghost than dominion. Normandy was lost. The barons were fractured. The treasury lay buried in silt and salt water. The crown itself had passed from iron grip to trembling hands. And yet something survived. Not the man, not even the monarchy as it had once been understood, but the idea fragile, barely ink on parchment, that no ruler is above the law, that even a king must answer to justice, that liberty, however imperfect, must have its defenders. That idea endured, flickering like a candle protected by weathered hands. In the years that followed John's death, Magna Carta would be reissued again and again, first by the regents of the boy king Henry III, then by Henry himself, and later by monarchs who sought to purchase peace or legitimacy with the promise of restraint. Each time its clauses were amended, its language shaped by time, but its core remained, a charter of limits, a whisper from the past that reminded the present it did not own the future. At first it was a document of the nobility, a tool for the barons to check the arrogance of their sovereign. But over time, it became something more, something wider. It reached the ears of judges. It entered the mouths of philosophers. It crossed oceans and ignited revolutions. In the 17th century, English lawyers would invoke Magna Carta to challenge the absolutism of the Stuart kings. In the 18th century, American colonists would cite it in their Declaration of Independence. In the 20th century, fragments of its spirit would find their way into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What had once been a desperate compromise in a meadow beside the Thames became a cornerstone of civilization, a seed planted in the filth of tyranny that blossomed into the foundation of legal restraint and human dignity. And the irony, that maddening, inescapable irony, is that it came from him. From John, a man who ruled through fear and paranoia, a man who broke oaths as casually as bread, a man who betrayed his kin, extorted his subjects, defied the church, and died as he had lived alone, unloved and drowning in the consequences of his own appetites. No epic last words. No triumphal funeral, just a foul-smelling end in a damp room and a name so reviled that for over 800 years no English monarch would name a son John again. Yet history, in its peculiar cruelty, remembers not only greatness, it remembers caution. It remembers those whose failures built bridges they never walked across. It remembers those whose corruption gave birth to reform. It remembers John Lackland not because he was brilliant, or just, or wise, but because he was none of those things, and because in the absence of those virtues, the world was forced to imagine something better. He left no empire. He left no love. He left only a story grotesque, absurd, humbling, and a document that has outlived every man, throne, and boundary it was written to restrain. That is what remains of empire. Not the gold, not the sword, not even the crown. What remains is the lesson. That unchecked power corrodes everything it touches. That tyranny, even when draped in ermine, eventually collapses under its own weight. That a man who lost everything, his lands, his people, his dignity, even the contents of his own body, could still, in dying, give birth to something immortal. He gave us Magna Carta. He gave it unwillingly, bitterly, and accidentally. But he gave it. And for that, the world, even while recoiling from his memory, remembers his name. Not with honor, but with consequence.